Welcome to Late Night Explainer. Tonight, settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the day you carried into this room loosen its grip, one finger at a time, and set itself down somewhere just outside the door. You do not need it anymore, not tonight. Tonight we are going somewhere very old and very quiet, and there is nothing you have to do but listen and drift. Imagine, for a moment, a small room in the city of Florence, more than 600 years ago. The shutters are closed against the evening. A single oil lamp burns on a wooden table, and the light it throws is soft and golden and trembles a little when someone breathes. On that table is a book. Not a beautiful book, not a painted one, not gilded, not the kind you would put on display. A plain ledger bound in leather, worn smooth at the corners by the same pair of hands, turning the same pages night after night, year after year. And inside that book are numbers, columns of them written in a careful, slanting hand. To you and me they would look like nothing at all. Quiet rows of figures, debits on one side, credits on the other, sums carried down and balanced against one another with a patience that is almost like prayer. But this book is a secret. The people who keep it call it the libro segreto, which simply means the secret book, and it is exactly that, the true book. The book that records what the family really earns, what its partners really own, what its managers are really paid, kept apart from all the ordinary ledgers that anyone might be allowed to see. And here is the strange, soft thing I want you to hold in your mind as you begin to drift. From those quiet columns of numbers, written by lamplight in a closed room, came the dome of a golden age. From those figures came a bronze statue of a boy named David, the first freestanding nude cast in Europe since the days of ancient Rome, made for one single family and standing in the courtyard of their house. From the slow arithmetic in that secret book came libraries and basilicas and the painters and the poets and the philosophers we still speak of today. The art was the bright, visible thing. The numbers in the dark were the engine that made it. This is the story of that family and of the bank they built and of how it rose and how, in the end, it came apart. The family was called the Medici. The bank was the Banco dei Medici, the Medici Bank. And though the name might make you think first of paintings and palaces and princes, the truth underneath is gentler and stranger than that. The truth is that the Medici did not simply buy the Renaissance with a mountain of gold. They engineered it with an accounting method and a way of organizing a company that was centuries ahead of its time. The treasure everyone remembers was only the exhaust, the bright smoke, of an invisible machine made of ledgers and letters and trust. Tonight, slowly, over the long hours ahead, we are going to walk all the way down into that machine and that family, from the first room in Florence to the last day the bank existed. We are going to take it gently. There is no hurry. Nothing in this story needs you to stay awake to the end, and you are welcome to fall asleep anywhere along the way. The Medici took the better part of a century to rise and fall. We have all night. Before we go further, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Tell me in the comments, whenever it suits you, no rush at all, what city, what country, what quiet corner of the world. There's something I find soothing about it, picturing all of us scattered across the dark, listening to the same old story at the same late hour. And if you're new here, and if a slow story by lamplight is the kind of thing that helps you find your way to sleep, you might think about subscribing so the next one finds you when you need it. That's all the asking I'll do. Now let the practical world go and let us go back to the beginning. The beginning has a date, and the date is the year 1397. In that year, in Florence, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici founded the bank that would carry his family's name across Europe. Say the name slowly to yourself, the way you might learn the name of a quiet stranger you've just been introduced to. Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. He was not a young man when he did it. He was somewhere near his late 30s, born around the year 1360, a careful, watchful, unshowy sort of person, the kind who notices everything and says little. If you had passed him in the street, you would not have looked twice. He did not want you to look twice. That, it turns out, was part of his genius. Giovanni had not invented banking, and he had not started out alone. Before he ever hung his own name over a door, he had learned the whole trade from the inside, the way an apprentice learns a craft by standing at the master's elbow for years until his own hands know it without thinking. He had worked in Rome in the branch of a bank run by a relative of his, a man named Vieri di Cambio de' Medici. Picture that for a moment, a young man from Florence, sent south to the great old city of Rome, sitting in a counting house among the ledgers and the coins and the constant traffic of merchants and clergymen, watching how money moved, how it was recorded, how it was made to multiply quietly and safely without ever once leaving the page. And what Giovanni learned in Rome was not how to be flashy, it was how to be careful. He learned how to weigh a risk before he took it. He learned how to keep a clean book. He learned that the surest money was not the loud gambling kind, but the patient kind, the kind that came from doing 100 small, safe transactions correctly rather than one great reckless one. He learned, above all, the value of trust, because a bank is, when you strip everything else away, only a promise that the money you hand over will be there in another form or another city when you come back for it. The whole towering edifice rests on that one fragile thing, people believing the promise will be kept. Giovanni di Bicci understood that a banker's most valuable possession is not his gold, but his reputation, and he guarded his as a careful gardener guards a slow-growing tree. In 1397, having learned all of this, he made his decision. He moved the center of his own affairs to Florence and set up his bank there, in his home city, and that quiet act is the seed from which everything else in our long story grows. The Banco dei Medici, founded in 1397 in Florence by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici. Hold that single fact like a small, smooth stone in your hand. Everything else we say tonight, every branch and every loan and every painting and every triumph and every disaster, grows outward from that one room and that one year. Now you might wonder about the name itself, and it is a pleasant, small thing to wonder about as you settle deeper into the pillow. Medici. In Italian, the word means doctors, physicians, healers. There is an old, fond story that the family were descended from doctors, and that this is why the word for healers became their name. On their coat of arms there are round shapes, red roundels on a field of gold, called the palle, the balls, and people have argued for centuries about what they are. Some say they are pills, the medicine that goes with the name of doctors. Some say they are coins which would suit a family of bankers very neatly indeed. Some say they are only dents in an old shield. Nobody can say for certain, and it does not greatly matter for our story tonight. But I rather like that even the family's own symbol is a small mystery, those quiet gold circles that might be medicine or might be money or might be nothing at all, glinting at the edge of a tale that is in so many ways a tale about coins. Because to understand what Giovanni built, you have to understand the coin he built it on, and that coin was the florin. The florin, the fiorino. A small disc of gold first minted in Florence in the year 1252, more than 100 years before Giovanni founded his bank. Imagine holding one. It is not large. It would sit comfortably in the curve of your palm, warm from your own hand, heavier than you might expect because gold is dense and serious in a way that lighter metals are not. On one side, the lily of Florence. On the other, the figure of John the Baptist, the city's patron saint. And the thing that made the florin extraordinary was not its beauty but its steadiness. Its gold content stayed reliable year after year, decade after decade, when the coins of so many other places were quietly thinned and cheapened by rulers desperate for money. The florin kept its word. A florin was a florin in Florence, and it was a florin in Rome, and it was a florin in London and Bruges and a dozen cities between. It became, in a sense the people of that age would not have used, but we can, a reserve currency. A coin so trusted that it crossed borders and languages and suspicions, a coin a merchant in the far north would accept from a stranger because he knew, without having to test it, exactly what it was worth. And this is the monetary water in which the Medici learned to swim. Think of it that way, as a kind of sea. The florin was the trusted water that filled the harbours of European trade, the medium in which value could float from one city to another. A banking family does not create such a thing on its own. The Medici did not make the florin, but they were born into a city whose coin the whole continent trusted, and that trust was a gift, a foundation already laid, a stable ground on which a clever and careful man could build something tall. Giovanni di Bicci built on it. He took the reputation of Florence's gold and added to it the reputation of his own steady hand, and the two together made a thing more powerful than either alone. So now we have our beginning. A careful man trained in Rome, founding his bank in Florence in 1397 in a city whose coin was the most trusted in the world. But a bank, even a careful one, even one built on the soundest coin in Europe, needs something more than steadiness to become great. It needs a source, a wellspring, a single great current of money flowing past its door that it can dip into day after day and from which it can draw its profit. Every great fortune has such a source somewhere near its root, and the Medici fortune had one too, and it was perhaps the most surprising source you could imagine. The wellspring was the church. Let that sit gently for a moment, because there is something quietly astonishing in it, and we will come back to the full strangeness of it later when we talk about the rules the church had laid down about money and how the Medici slipped through them like water through a closed hand. For now, simply hold the picture. The single most profitable part of the Medici Bank for much of its long life was the branch in Rome. And what the Rome branch did above all else was handle the money of the church itself. Picture the scale of it. The church in those days was not only a faith, it was an institution that stretched across the whole of Christendom, from the cold edges of the north to the warm shores of the south, gathering in revenues from countless bishoprics and abbeys and parishes, dues and tithes and fees flowing inward from every corner of Europe toward Rome. All of that money had to be collected. It had to be moved, sometimes across vast distances. It had to be kept and recorded and paid out again where it was needed. The treasury of the popes had a name, the Apostolic Camera, the chamber, the great financial heart of the church. And the family that managed the money of that chamber, that held the papal account, that carried the church's wealth in its ledgers and moved it safely across the continent, stood at the very center of the richest single flow of money in all of Europe. The Medici became that family. Slowly, carefully, by being reliable when others were not, by keeping their promises and their books in good order, Giovanni di Bicci and those who came after him wove themselves into the financial life of the papacy until the Rome branch, handling the affairs of the Apostolic Camera, became the golden core of the whole enterprise. The profit that flowed from managing the church's money was the deep, steady current that funded everything else, not the loud loans to kings that everyone tells stories about. Not even, at first, the famous patronage of art. The quiet, steady, enormously lucrative work of being the Pope's banker. That was the well from which the Medici drew, and it was a deep well, and for a long time it did not run dry. But how does such a relationship begin? Trust like that is not granted overnight. It is earned, and sometimes it is earned in turbulent times when a steady hand is worth more than gold. And the times when Giovanni di Bicci was building his bank were turbulent indeed, for the church itself was in the strangest crisis of its long history. This was the age of what later came to be called the Western Schism, and it is worth understanding gently because it shows you the kind of dangerous, uncertain water in which the Medici learned to keep their footing. For a span of years, the church did not have one pope. It had two, and at one point, astonishingly, it had three. Different lines of claimants, each insisting he was the true successor, and the others were impostors, each with his own followers among the kingdoms and the cardinals of Europe. Imagine the confusion of it. Imagine being a faithful person in a small town somewhere and not being able to say with certainty who, in the whole wide world, was the true head of your faith. The church, which was meant to be the one solid and eternal thing in a changing world, had split, and the cracks ran through everything, through politics, through loyalty, through money. And in such a time, where do you put your trust and where do you put your money? These were not idle questions for a banker. To back one claimant was to make an enemy of the others. To handle the wrong man's money was to risk everything if he fell. It took nerve and it took judgment, and Giovanni di Bicci had both, though he wore them so quietly you might not have seen them. In the middle of all of this stood a figure named Baldassare Cossa. He was one of the claimants to the papal throne in those divided years, recognized by some, denied by others, and he took the name John the 23rd. Now here I must pause and speak carefully, the way one ought to when the records themselves are tangled, because history did not in the end count him among the true line of popes. The title was later set aside, considered the name of an antipope, one of the rival claimants from the years of the schism, and the very name John the 23rd was taken up again, freely and without confusion, by a true pope many centuries later, in our own modern age. So when you hear the name in this old story, do not mistake it for the later, gentler man who bore it. This was a different figure from a turbulent and divided time. What matters for our story is the financial thread, and that thread is clear. The Medici and Giovanni di Bicci in particular attached their fortunes to this claimant during those uncertain years, and through him and through their growing role as a leading depository of papal money, they wove themselves ever more tightly into the financial fabric of the church. It was a bet in a way, a careful, calculated bet placed in a time of confusion. And though the man himself was in the end deposed and his title struck from the rolls, the relationship the Medici built with the machinery of papal finance, with the great chamber of the Camera, outlasted the rise and fall of any single claimant. The current kept flowing, and the Medici kept their place beside it. This is something worth holding on to as you grow drowsy because it tells you the deep character of the family in these early years. They were not gamblers in the wild sense. They placed bets, yes, but they placed them carefully, hedged them, watched them, and what they were truly building was not any single fortune from any single patron, but a position, a place in the flow of things. They made themselves necessary. They made themselves the safe pair of hands into which the most powerful institution in Europe was willing to place its money. And once you have made yourself necessary to the powerful, you have something far more durable than gold. You have a roll that does not vanish when one man dies or one claimant falls. The popes might change, the claimants might rise and be cast down, but the money still had to move, and the book still had to balance, and the Medici were the ones who could be trusted to do it. And so the shape of the early bank comes clear. A foundation of trust learned in Rome under Vieri di Cambio, a home in Florence, the city of the trusted golden florin, and a wellspring in the affairs of the Church, the Apostolic Camera, the papal treasury, with the Rome branch as the golden core from which profit steadily flowed. From this base in the years and decades to come, the bank would spread its branches outward across Europe, north into the cold cloth-trading cities, and it would develop a quiet, brilliant machinery of accounting and organization that we will explore together in the hours ahead. And out of all that machinery, almost as an afterthought, almost as the warm light thrown off by a deep and well-tended fire, would come the art and the beauty for which the family is now most remembered. But understand the order of things, because it is the heart of our whole story, and I want it to settle into you as gently as sleep. The art came last. The art was the visible part. Underneath it, holding it up, came the patient mechanism, and underneath the mechanism, at the very root, came this: a careful man, a trusted coin, a secret book by lamplight, and the steady golden current of the Church's money flowing past a door in Rome. There is a particular kind of peace, I think, in the thought of those early counting houses. No drama in them, not really. No shouting, no glittering display. Only the scratch of a pen, the soft chink of coins being counted and set in their places, the quiet murmur of one careful man explaining a figure to another. Letters arriving from distant cities, dusty from the road, unfolded and read by lamplight, and answered the same night. The slow, certain turning of a page in a ledger. There is something in that image as restful as a fire burning low, as restful as rain on a roof when you are warm and dry beneath it. The whole great Renaissance, with all its colour and genius and tumult still to come, began in rooms as quiet as the one you are lying in now. So let yourself rest there for a while in the lamplight of that first room in Florence. Let the careful figure of Giovanni di Bicci move about his work, weighing his risks, keeping his promises, balancing his secret book. He does not know, this watchful, unshowy man, what he has set in motion. He cannot see the popes his descendants will become, or the queens, or the painters, or the great bronze boy that will one day stand in a courtyard cast from the profits of his patience. He cannot see the duke who will die in the snow, or the branch in the far north that will fall, or the year the whole thing will come undone. He can see only the page in front of him, the lamp, the column of numbers, the work of the day. And that is enough. That is all any of us can see most nights. The page in front of us and the warm, small circle of the lamp. We have a long way still to travel together, through the great machine of the double books, through the clever structure of separate partnerships that walled off failure from failure, through the surprising trick of lending to a church that had forbidden lending, through the grey rock in the hills near Rome that the whole of Europe could not live without. We will meet Cosimo, who ruled a city without ever wearing a crown. We will meet Lorenzo, called the Magnificent, and learn the quiet irony hidden inside that bright name. We will follow the branches north to Bruges and London, and we will see what happens when a banker forgets the careful lessons that a man like Giovanni di Bicci learned in a back room in Rome. But none of that is for now. For now, there is only the beginning. The lamp, the book, the year 1397, the trusted coin, and the careful man, and the deep, golden current beginning to flow. Breathe with it. Let the figures in the secret book blur and soften. Let the lamplight dim. Let the long, quiet history carry you, the way the bills of exchange we will speak of later carried value across a continent, silently, safely, without anything seeming to move at all. There is no need to follow every thread. The story will hold itself together whether you are awake for it or not. That is the gift of a story this old. It has already happened. Every page has already been turned. every number already balanced, every life already lived and gone. There is nothing left in it to fear and nothing left in it to do. You can simply rest inside it, the way you might rest inside an old, well-built house, listening to the wind outside and knowing the walls will keep. And the walls of this house were built in Florence in 1397 by a quiet man with a steady hand and a secret book. We will go on building, room by room, all through the night. So begin with the book itself, since the book is where the truth was kept. Each branch of the Medici Bank kept two sets of records. There were the working accounts, the everyday ledgers, the ordinary traffic of money coming in and money going out, the kind of thing any clerk might see. And then there was something quieter and more closely held, the libro segreto, the secret book. In it were written the things that mattered most and were shared least, the true profits, the real capital each partner had laid down, the salaries, the private arrangements between the men who actually owned the thing. The working books were the face the bank showed the world. The secret book was its mind. And it is from these secret books, copied and folded into the archives of Florence and read centuries later by patient historians, that we know what we know. The figures in them are the reason a story like this can be told at all. Without them, the Medici would be only a rumor of wealth, a name attached to gold with no way to weigh it. With them, the careful columns let us see the engine turning. So when you picture Donatello's bronze David, that smooth and startling figure cast for the Medici, the first freestanding nude since the ancient world, remember that somewhere behind it sat a quiet column of numbers in a book no one outside the family was meant to read. The bronze was the visible thing, the secret book was the source, but the book did not come first. The man came first. His name was Giovanni di Bicci de Medici, born around the year 1360, and he was not a magnificent man. That word would be saved for a grandson he would never meet. Giovanni was something rarer and, in the end, more useful. He was careful. He learned his trade the way careful men do, slowly and from below, working in the Rome branch of a bank run by a relative, a man called Vieri di Cambio de Medici. Picture him there, a young man in Rome, among the ledgers and the letters, learning how money moved and where it pooled, and which men could be trusted with it and which could not. He learned the lessons of caution in that back room, and he never quite forgot them. Generations later, when those lessons were forgotten by men who had never had to learn them, the whole thing would come undone. But that is far away, on the other side of a long night. In 1397, Giovanni di Bicci set out on his own, and he made his choice. He moved the center of the thing to Florence. That is the year to hold. That is the founding. The Banco dei Medici, the Medici Bank, born in 1397 in a city that was just then the right city to be born in, because Florence had a coin, and the coin is half the story. It was called the Fiorino, the florin, a small disc of gold that had first been minted in the year 1252, long before Giovanni was born. By the time he opened his doors, it had become something close to the reserve currency of Europe. Its weight of gold was steady and known and trusted trust is the only thing a coin truly is. A florin in Florence was a florin in Bruges and a florin in Rome. Merchants across the continent could reckon in it, lend in it, settle in it, knowing the gold inside would not quietly thin from one year to the next. The florin was the firm ground the Medici would build on. You cannot run a bank across a continent on a coin no one believes in. They had a coin everyone believed in. Picture the whole of it then. In the year 1397, a careful man trained in Rome who has come home to Florence, a coin of trusted gold humming through every market from England to the East, and a secret book waiting to be opened in which the true shape of a fortune would be written down one balanced line at a time. If you are still here, still drifting along with this, then let me ask you, Something simple, the way I always do, before the lamplight dims any further. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. What city, what country, what dark window. I find I genuinely like to know, and if you are new here and you think you might want more nights like this one, more slow journeys into old and quiet stories, then subscribe and they will come to you. That is all. We can go back to Florence now, because the careful man and the trusted coin were only the ground. The river that flowed over that ground, the deep, golden current that made the Medici more than just another Florentine house of money, came from a single place. It came from Rome. It came from the church. The most profitable arm of the Medici Bank for the long heart of its history was the branch in Rome. And the reason was the Apostolic Camera, the papal treasury, the great purse of the church itself. Christendom was vast, and its money flowed inward from everywhere. Dues and tithes and offerings gathered across 1,000 parishes in 100 lands, all of it needing to be collected, transferred, held, and accounted for. Someone had to move that money, someone had to keep its books, and Giovanni di Bicci, with his careful hands and his Roman training, made certain that someone was a Medici. It began in earnest in dangerous and divided times. The church in those years was split against itself, the long quarrel we call the Western Schism, when rival men each claimed to be the true pope and Christendom did not know which way to bow. Into that confusion stepped a figure named Baldassare Cossa, who would be known as the anti-pope John Weinhecht, a title the centuries would later quietly reuse for another man entirely. Giovanni di Bicci backed him. He lent the bank's strength and its standing to Cossa's cause, and the Medici Bank became a leading keeper of papal money. The schism was a storm. Giovanni stood in it and came out richer with the church's treasury flowing through his books. And there is the beginning of the golden current, the careful man, the trusted coin, and now the deep papal river running through the Rome branch in the dark. Let it run, let it carry you a little further down, and so we come to the numbers. The deep, quiet numbers that made everything else possible. To understand what the Medici Bank actually was, it is what it did each day, what made it different from a money lender sitting in a doorway or a merchant hiding silver under floorboards. You have to sit with the books for a moment, not the grand books of history, not the chronicles and the poems and the portraits, the actual books, the ledgers, the columns of careful figures that the scribes entered each morning by candlelight, the scratched ink on vellum that was, in truth, the real architecture of the Renaissance. The system the Medici used was called partita doppia, double entry. The name is almost too plain for what it represented. Every transaction recorded twice. Every sum that entered the books appeared as both a debit and a credit. Written on opposite sides of the ledger, the two columns required to balance against each other at the end of any accounting period. If they did not balance, something was wrong. Something had been missed, or misrepresented, or stolen. The balance was both a tool and a discipline, a mathematical conscience that could not be argued with. Think of it this way: if numbers feel cold and distant on the edge of sleep, imagine carrying water from a spring to a cistern. Every bucket you draw from the spring must arrive in the cistern. If at the end of the day your cistern has less water than your buckets carried, you know, some was spilled or someone drank from it on the road. The double-entry ledger worked on exactly that principle. You could not lose water silently. The columns would tell on you. This method was not invented by the Medici. Let that be said plainly, because the fuller truth is more interesting than the simpler legend. Double-entry bookkeeping had been practiced among Italian merchants, in Genoa, in Venice, in the trading cities of Tuscany. Since at least the 13th and 14th centuries, the commune accounts of Genoa from 1340 survive as among the earliest known examples. The method was already in the air of Italian commerce when Giovanni di Bicci learned his trade. What the Medici did was use it more systematically, more thoroughly, across a wider network of offices with greater discipline than almost anyone before them. They did not invent the tool, they mastered it, and the mastery was the genius. There is a small, poignant symmetry of dates worth holding in the mind. The year the Medici Bank effectively died, 1494, the year of expulsion, of collapse, of the whole edifice crumbling, was also the year a Franciscan friar named Luca Pacioli published a book called Summa de Aritmetica, Geometria, Proporzioni et Proporzionalità. It was the first printed treatise to set down and codify the double-entry method in full, to explain to the world what the Venetian and Tuscan merchants had been quietly doing in their account rooms for generations. Pacioli described the system they had already been using. He called himself not the inventor, but the transmitter, the man who wrote down what commerce already knew. The same year, the greatest practitioner of double-entry accounting in European history lost everything, a friar published the manual for it. History occasionally offers these ironies with a dry, unhurried patience, the way a tide leaves something beautiful and strange on the sand just as it pulls back from the shore. But the ordinary ledgers, the daily working accounts, were not the whole story. Inside the Medici system there was another book, kept separate, kept close, kept quiet. It was called the libro segreto, the secret book. Every branch of the Medici Bank maintained one. It was not the book the clerks worked in each morning, not the running account of daily exchange and commodity sales. It was a deeper record, a more private one, held by the senior partners and not shown to the general staff. In the libro segreto you would find the true figures, the real profits of the branch, the capital each partner had committed, the salaries paid to the principal men, the actual state of the bank's position stripped of the everyday noise of commerce. It was the brain behind the face, the true accounting of what a branch had made and what it owed to whom in the innermost circle. Historians know what they know about the Medici Bank's real finances largely because some of these secret books survived. They are in Florence still, in the great Florentine archive known as the Mediceo avanti il Principato, the Medici papers from before the Principate, the records that predate the family's transformation into Grand Dukes and hereditary rulers. From those quiet columns of ink, the scholar Raymond de Ruver spent years reconstructing the bank's life in his foundational work, The Rise and Decline of the Medici Bank, 1397 to 1494, published by Harvard in 1963. De Ruver's patient reading of the secret books is the bedrock on which any serious account of the Medici Bank must stand. What the Libri Segreti revealed, among other things, was how the bank actually divided its rewards. A branch manager did not simply draw a salary, he was a junior partner, a participant in the profits of his branch, a man with skin in the game. When the Venice branch prospered, the man running the Venice branch prospered with it. When the Bruges branch stumbled, the Bruges manager felt the stumble in his own pocket. This was deliberate. It was a way of aligning the incentives of men far from Florence. Men, the central partners, could not watch directly with the interests of the bank itself. If you share in the gains, you will care about managing the risks. It was, in the language a later century would reach for, a form of profit-sharing agency, a way of making distant employees behave like owners. The concept is not exotic to us now. We have grown up surrounded by companies built on stock options and partnership shares and bonus structures meant to tie individual interest to collective health. But this was the 15th century. The Medici were doing this with quill pens and candlelight, managing a network of branch offices across a continent with no telegraph, no railway, no printed newspaper, no means of instant communication of any kind. Only letters carried by horse and ship, arriving days or weeks after they were written. The whole structure depended in the end on something the ledgers could not fully capture: trust. trust between Giovanni and his successors and the men they placed in distant cities. Trust that those men would read the secret books honestly, report their positions accurately, refrain from the tempting loans to powerful strangers that the Home Office would never sanction. When that trust held, the system worked with a remarkable elegance. When it frayed, as it eventually would, the elegance turned brittle. But we are ahead of ourselves. Set that thought down for a moment. Let it rest at the edge of the story, where it belongs. The Medici Bank was not only a bank. That is the other thing the ledgers reveal if you read them across their full breadth. Alongside the financial operations, the Medici maintained what they called botteghe, workshops, literally shops, the word carrying its old plain meaning without apology. In Florence, the family operated cloth manufactories working in wool and silk, the two great luxury fabrics of the medieval and Renaissance economy. This made the Medici not simply a financial institution that lent and exchanged and collected, but a diversified merchant enterprise, producers as well as bankers, manufacturers as well as lenders. The bank and the bottega breathed together, each feeding the other, cloth revenues supporting the bank's capital in lean years, bank profits expanding the workshops in good ones. It was a sensible arrangement for uncertain times. A pure bank, dependent entirely on the flows of financial exchange, would be vulnerable to the sudden freezing of credit that a war or a plague or a monarch's caprice could cause. A business with manufacturing roots could keep producing cloth even when lending dried up. Diversification was not a strategy the Medici named or theorized. They would not have used that word, but it was what they practiced with the practical intelligence of men who understood that the world could change without warning. Now, the Church. We have already arrived at the Rome branch, at the papal treasury, at the Apostolic Camera sending its revenues through Medici books. But the question the careful mind must ask is this: how? How does a bank do business with an institution that has officially, formally, theologically forbidden the practice of lending money at interest? Because the Church had done exactly that. Usury, the charging of interest on a loan, was a sin. It was condemned by Scripture, by canon law, by centuries of theological reasoning. The merchant who lent 100 florins and expected 110 in return was, in the eyes of the Church, doing something morally identical to the thief, taking something that was not his, namely time, which belonged to God alone. And yet there sat the Medici, managing the Pope's money, moving the Church's wealth across Christendom, growing rich in the service of the very institution that had declared the central act of banking a sin. How? The answer was the lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange. Think of it, again, in slow and picturable terms. A merchant in Florence needs to pay a supplier in Bruges. He does not want to carry gold across the Alps and through the bandit-haunted roads of Europe. He goes instead to a Medici branch in Florence and deposits his florins there. He receives a piece of paper, the bill of exchange, a formal letter of credit written in careful commercial language addressed to the Medici branch in Bruges. He travels to Bruges or sends an agent and presents the bill. The Bruges branch pays him in the local currency in Flemish money. The transfer is complete. But notice what has happened between the two moments, the deposit in Florence and the payment in Bruges. Time has passed, the exchange rate between the florin and the Flemish currency has moved. Perhaps it has moved in the Medici's favour. They paid out in Bruges what the bill demanded, but the conversion rate they used and the rate at which they had booked the deposit in Florence were not the same rate. The difference was the profit, not interest, exchange. The Church's prohibition was on charging interest for the use of money over time. Exchange rates, the natural fluctuation of currency values in different markets, This was something else. Or at any rate, this was what the church's canon lawyers and the Florentine merchants and the Roman curia, in their collective and mutually convenient wisdom, decided it was. The Medici lent to the Pope, they moved the Pope's money across Europe, they grew enormously rich doing so, and at no point did they formally charge interest on any of it. They charged exchange. The theology was, by any honest reckoning, flexible to the point of transparency. But the flexibility served everyone. The church needed its revenues moved and managed. The Medici needed papal business. The canon lawyers needed a formulation that did not require the church to condemn the very institution managing its own treasury. And so the bill of exchange became the instrument of a civilized and mutually profitable fiction, the kind of arrangement that large institutions and their bankers have always found a way to construct, in every age and under every prohibition. It was an elegant solution. It was also, in its own quiet way, a kind of accounting technology, not a set of numbers in a ledger, but a legal instrument, a piece of paper, a portable promise. The lettera di cambio moved value across space without moving gold, which reduced the danger of robbery on the roads and the cost of physical transport. It compressed distance. It made the Bruges branch, in a practical sense, almost as immediate as a room down the hall, and it made the Medici Bank not merely a local institution, but a genuinely continental one, woven into the fabric of European commerce at every node where cloth was sold or grain was shipped or pilgrims paid their fees. All of this, the double entry books, the secret ledger, the separate partnerships, the botteg, the bills of exchange bending around the usury prohibition, all of it had been built patiently by the founding generation, by Giovanni di Bicci and the men he trained, and after Giovanni, by the greatest of the Medici's early line. His name was Cosimo. Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1389, the son of Giovanni di Bicci, and the man who would take everything his father had carefully built and carry it to a scale that would make the Medici name synonymous, not just with banking, but with power itself, with the kind of power that does not need a crown to be real. Cosimo inherited the bank on his father's death in 1429. He had been preparing for it his whole life, educated in the bank's practices, familiar with the Rome branch and its papal connections, trained in the arithmetic and correspondence that were the bank's daily language. What he brought to it that his father had possessed, but perhaps not fully used, was a political intelligence of unusual depth, an understanding that money in the right hands, flowing in the right directions, could do what armies were supposed to do: secure loyalty, neutralize enemies, construct a world in which the man controlling the money was, de facto, the man controlling everything. Florence was a republic, or at least it called itself one, in the way that certain cities of that era called themselves republics, while being managed in practice by a small constellation of powerful families who filled the councils and influenced the magistracies and understood that the language of civic virtue was most useful when spoken by the people who already had everything. The Medici did not rule Florence in name. Cosimo held no permanent office. He was not a king or a lord or a duke. He was a citizen, a merchant, a banker, and from that position he governed the city as completely as any monarch governed a kingdom, through the patient and relentless exercise of financial patronage, political alliance, and the quiet pressure of debt. Because when enough of Florence owed the Medici money, or hoped for Medici favor, or feared Medici displeasure, the Republic bent in the direction the Medici pointed. But it was not easy. Not at first. Not without cost. In 1433, when Cosimo had already built the bank further and extended Medici influence further into Florentine politics, the great rival families, or the Albizzi chief among them, moved against him. They had him arrested. They debated his execution. In the end, they settled for exile, expelling Cosimo and his closest allies from Florence, believing that without the man present, without his daily management and his network of obligation, the Medici grip on the city would loosen and the rivals could reclaim their ground. They miscalculated. Cosimo went to Venice, which was among the wealthiest and most powerful cities in Europe, and which was delighted to receive him. He brought the bank's contacts, the bank's capital, the bank's web of allegiance, and Florence, without him, found itself in a peculiar position. The money that the Medici had moved through the city, the credit that had lubricated so much of its commerce, the loans that had quietly sustained so many of its prominent families, that money became less available. The city felt the withdrawal, and the citizens who had watched the Albizzi engineer the exile began, gradually, to remember whose bank had been making Florence's economy work. Within a year, in 1434, Cosimo was recalled. He came back to Florence in something very close to triumph, and the men who had exiled him found themselves expelled in turn, the wheel of city politics having turned against them with the same efficient cruelty it had shown the Medici 12 months before. From that point forward, Cosimo's position in Florence was never again seriously challenged. He had demonstrated the most important thing a powerful man in a republic can demonstrate, that the city needs him more than he needs the city. Or at least, he had arranged matters so that it felt that way, which amounts to the same thing. The next 30 years, from 1434 to his death in 1464, were the long golden age of Cosimo de' Medici. The bank continued to expand. The papal treasury connection held and deepened. The branches across Europe sent their revenues back to Florence in those careful bills of exchange, and the libri segreti recorded profits that allowed the Medici to do something that very few accumulations of private wealth in history have ever done with such consistency and such effect: spend on beauty. Not spend carelessly. Cosimo was not a man of careless impulse. He spent on beauty the way he kept his books, deliberately, with an eye on what the expenditure would return in reputation, in loyalty, in the alignment of the world toward Medici ends. But the beauty itself was real, regardless of the calculation behind it. The buildings rose, the manuscripts arrived, the scholars gathered. He commissioned the rebuilding of the convent of San Marco, the quiet Dominican house in Florence that Cosimo made into something extraordinary. Fra Angelico, the Dominican friar, who painted with a fineness of line and a luminosity of color that his contemporaries found almost impossible to explain, decorated the convent cells one by one, each small room given its own painting to wake to in the morning and contemplate before sleep. The Annunciation at the top of the stairs, the angel's wings still catching an impossible light after 5 centuries. This was Medici money made into something that has no price. He turned his attention to the Basilica of San Lorenzo, the ancient church of the Medici's neighborhood in Florence, and undertook its rebuilding into something worthy of the family's new stature. The architect was Brunelleschi at first, and then the project continued and expanded. San Lorenzo became the Medici church, the place where the family's dead would be laid and their living would be seen, the building that translated money into stone and stone into permanence. And he built the Palazzo Medici, designed by the architect Michelozzo di Bartolomeo, a building of great dignity on the Via Larga, the broad street running through Florence's center, with its rusticated stone exterior and its colonnaded inner courtyard open to the Florentine sky. It became the prototype for the Renaissance palazzo, the form that wealthy Florentines would imitate for generations. The clear classical proportions, the way the building declared wealth without screaming it, the urban gravity of a structure that knew exactly what it was. Inside the palazzo and around the Medici table gathered the men of letters and philosophy who gave the Florentine Renaissance much of its intellectual character. Cosimo supported what became known as the Platonic Academy, a loose gathering of scholars and thinkers working to translate and interpret the texts of Plato and the Neoplatonists. Greek manuscripts that had come west as Constantinople moved toward its fall, carried by Byzantine scholars who brought their libraries with them. Cosimo collected these manuscripts with the same patient acquisitiveness he had brought to the bank's client list. He wanted, one senses, not just the books but the tradition they represented, the long line of human thought that they contained, a library that would make Florence not just the richest city in Christendom, but the wisest. And then there was Donatello. Lorenzo di Niccolò di Betto Bardi, who signed his work simply as Donatello, was among the great presences of the early Florentine Renaissance, a sculptor of an originality so complete that his contemporaries struggled to fit him into any category they knew. Cosimo was his patron, his supporter, his friend, in the deep way that a man who controls the money on which an artist depends can be a friend. And from that friendship or that patronage or that productive entanglement of genius and capital came, among other things, the Bronze David. The Bronze David stands slightly less than 1.5 meters tall. It has stood in various rooms and courtyards since Donatello completed it. The exact date is debated, but it was made for the Medici, and it stood in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici, the first freestanding nude sculpture in bronze since ancient Rome. It is a small, peculiar, mesmerizing thing, a young man at ease with his victory, his foot on the severed head of the giant, his expression composed and distant, his hat a wide-brimmed pastoral hat with a wreath of laurel, a detail so unexpected it still puzzles people who see it for the first time. Nobody quite knows what Donatello meant by it. The mystery is part of the work, but this is what is certain. Without the Medici Bank, without those columns of carefully balanced numbers in the partita doppia ledgers, without the Rome branch and the bills of exchange bending around the usury prohibition, without the secret books recording the true profits that Cosimo then directed towards stone and bronze and vellum, without all of that, the David does not exist. The sculpture you can see in the Bargello Museum in Florence today is a downstream consequence of an accounting technology practiced by a banker in Rome in the early decades of the 15th century. The art is the visible exhaust of an invisible financial engine. Hold that thought for a moment as you settle further into the dark. There is something worth sitting with in the recognition that the most beautiful things sometimes come from the most mechanical sources. From columns of numbers balancing in a candlelit room, from a piece of paper crossing the Alps to avoid the bandit roads, from a man calculating exchange rates in a city where the church forbade him from charging what he actually charged. The Renaissance, as it is pictured in our imagination, the light falling on marble, the angels on the convent walls, the bronze boy in his curious hat, was not born from some free and airy inspiration, untethered from the world of getting and spending. It was funded, it was financed, it had accounts. Cosimo grew old in Florence, governing and building and reading. He had been called many things in his long career, most of them by people who needed something from him. But the title that stayed, the one his city gave him after he died, was Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. It was a Roman title, deliberate in its classical reference, given to him not by a pope or a king, but by the Florentine Republic itself, the city acknowledging, in the language of ancient Rome, that this man without a crown had been, in some essential way, the one who held everything together. He died in August of 1464, old and ill, and largely confined to the Palazzo Medici, reading and thinking and receiving visitors who came to the man who had built their world. The bank was thriving. The branches were spread across Europe. The partnership structure was intact, the junior managers in their distant offices sharing their profits and keeping their secret books. The system was working in the way that a well-designed machine works when it is young and maintained, and the people running it understand why each part is there. What came next was the beginning of the long, slow, almost invisible fissure in the machinery. Not dramatic at first, not loud, the kind of fracture that only becomes visible once it has already gone too deep to repair. Cosimo's son, Piero, took over the bank. Piero di Cosimo de' Medici, born in 1416, who would be known to history as Piero the Gouty, an epithet that tells you something important about the circumstances of his rule. Gout, the inflammatory condition that swells and agonizes the joints that makes movement a project and rest a negotiation, had been with Piero for years. He was not a healthy man. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly talented one, though he was decent and conscientious in his way. The years of his leadership, from Cosimo's death in 1464 to Piero's own death in 1469, were brief and troubled. Piero's most significant financial act was also one of his most politically damaging. Recognizing that the bank's outstanding loans had accumulated to a level that troubled him, he ordered a general calling in of debts, demanding that those who owed the bank money repay their obligations. This was, in a technical sense, financially prudent. It was, in a political sense, a catastrophe. Many of those debtors were Florentine families of influence, people whose goodwill the Medici depended on, people who had grown accustomed to the Medici bank's willingness to let credit run long. Being pressed suddenly for repayment felt to them like a betrayal, like the quiet patron-client arrangement that had sustained the Medici's soft power had been weaponized against the very people it was supposed to protect. The backlash was swift and angry. A conspiracy formed against Piero, an attempt to displace him from his position of de facto leadership. It failed. Piero survived the challenge and died naturally, or as naturally as gout allows, in December of 1469. He had kept the bank functioning, kept the partnerships in order, kept the secret books balanced. But he had also introduced briefly a sourness into the relationship between the Medici and the Florentine elite that would take his son years to fully sweeten back. His son, who was, at the age of 20, handed the whole inheritance. The bank, the partnerships, the papal connection, the workshops, the client list, the political alliances, the branches from Rome to Bruges to London, the weight of everything Giovanni and Cosimo had built. A young man of 20 in 1469 who was Lorenzo de' Medici, born in 1449, who would be called, in his own lifetime and in every generation since, Il Magnifico, the Magnificent, the name that has come to define the whole Medici epoch for most people who have ever heard of them, the name that stands like a bright pinnacle at the center of the Renaissance story, the poet, the statesman, the patron, the man who held Florence in an era of extraordinary intellectual flowering and made his court the most celebrated in Europe. All of that is true, and there is something else that is true, something that sits beside the magnificence like a shadow that only becomes visible in the right light. Lorenzo de' Medici was a neglectful banker, a careless banker, a man who had inherited the most sophisticated financial machine in Europe and who, over the course of his reign, allowed it to deteriorate through inattention and misplaced trust, who was more interested in the poems he wrote and the philosophy he discussed, and the political game he played with such exceptional skill than he was in the quarterly accounts of branches in distant cities. The machine his grandfather had built was designed to run on attention, on the disciplined oversight of branch managers whose incentive structures were carefully calibrated, but who, if left unwatched for long enough, would begin to make decisions that suited their own ambitions rather than the bank's health. Cosimo had watched. Giovanni di Bicci had watched. Lorenzo, largely, did not. But that unraveling is still ahead. For now, in this part of the story, Lorenzo is 20 years old, and has just stepped into a responsibility larger than almost any private person in Europe has ever carried. And there is still a great deal of the machine's workings we have not yet examined. There is the matter of a grey rock found in some hills near Rome, and what it means when a pope decides to hand control of a vital industrial mineral to his preferred banker. There is the matter of the branch offices spread across the northern textile world, the agents in Bruges and London, and their dangerous habit of lending to men who wore crowns. The secret books are still being kept, the bills of exchange are still crossing the mountains, the florin is still the soundest coin in Europe, and the Medici name is still the most trusted in finance. The late afternoon light of the Renaissance is still warm and generous, and the cities of Italy and Flanders and England have not yet begun to feel the chill that is coming. Sleep, if you are ready. The numbers are still balancing, the ledgers are still closed, the ink still fresh, the columns adding cleanly to their appointed sums. And in the dark of the Palazzo Medici, somewhere in the archive that will one day be called the Mediceo Avanti il Principato, the libri segreti lie folded and sealed, containing everything the bank truly was, written in the careful hand of men who understood that some truths are best kept in a separate book, away from the general account, in the quiet that only the most trusted partners are allowed to enter. We will open more of those pages soon. The grey rock found at Tolfa in 1462 was not much to look at. Giovanni di Castro, walking the low hills near Civitavecchia in the Papal States, would have seen scrub and pale stone, the kind of landscape that does not announce itself as important. But di Castro knew what he was looking for, and when he tested what he had found and confirmed its chemistry, he understood what he was holding. The rock was alum, not a trace of it, not a marginal deposit, a substantial working source of the mineral that the entire textile industry of Europe depended on to do the one thing dye cannot do alone, which is stay. Alum is a mordant. If you have never encountered that word, think of it this way. Dye, on its own, is a house guest with no intention of unpacking. It will sit on the surface of a cloth, brilliant and vivid, for a short time, and then the first washing will carry it away, and the cloth will be pale and ruined and worthless. A mordant is what you add to bind the dye into the fiber permanently, to make the color live inside the thread rather than merely coating it. Without alum, a scarlet cloak does not stay scarlet. A Flemish tapestry fades to nothing. The whole booming, dazzling world of European cloth, the deep crimsons of Florentine wool, the rich blues of Flemish weaving, the tapestries and altar cloths and merchant robes that spoke wealth to every eye that saw them, all of it required alum as a necessary precondition, the way bread requires salt or a portrait requires gesso before the paint can be applied. And for centuries, almost all of the alum available to Europe came from the East, from the Ottoman territories, from sources that were not Christian, not papal, not friendly to the commercial ambitions of the Italian city-states. Every bolt of cloth dyed in Florence or Bruges or Ghent carried inside it a small tribute to the Ottoman supply chain, an invisible economic thread running back to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the mines at Phocia and the trading routes of Anatolia. The textile world of Latin Christendom was chemically dependent on its commercial rivals, and there was no way around it, until there was. When Giovanni di Castro confirmed what lay beneath the hills at Tolfa, he went straight to Rome and to Pope Pius II, and what he said to the Pope has the quality of a man who understands he is carrying genuinely world-rearranging news. He told the Pope, in effect, that Christendom would no longer need to buy its mordant from the East, that the dyers of Europe could be freed from Ottoman alum. The Pope grasped the implications almost immediately, not only economic, but geopolitical, theological. The revenues from this new Tolfa operation could fund a crusade. The ban on Ottoman imports could be framed not as protectionism, but as piety. The Christian world would keep its cloth-making wealth inside Christian borders, and the proceeds would go toward defending the faith. It was a gift of remarkable convenience, and the question of who would manage it, who would extract it, market it across Europe, collect the revenues, and distribute them to Rome and to the project of Christendom's self-funding defense, was answered in the way that these questions were always answered in this period, by looking toward Florence and toward the bank whose men were already sitting inside the Apostolic Camera managing the Pope's accounts. The Medici were given a leading role in the Tolfa alum operation. Not every aspect of the mine's management rested with them exclusively. The arrangements were complex and shifted over time, and different popes renegotiated different terms. But the broad shape is clear. The family whose bank already held the papal treasury's trust was now also the preferred agent for marketing a mineral monopoly that the whole of European textile production depended on. They had moved from managing the Pope's money to managing the Pope's chemistry. Think of what that means. The Medici already had branches in the wool and cloth trading cities. They already knew the merchants who dyed the cloth and the agents who bought the raw mineral, and the factors in Bruges and London who moved finished goods and raw materials across the Northern Sea. When the Tolfa deposits came online, the bank was not learning a new business. It was inserting itself into a supply chain it already inhabited, adding a crucial upstream link. The letter of exchange that moved wool credit from London to Florence now had a cousin that moved alum credit from Civitavecchia to the dyers of the north. It was the same instrument, the same trusted signature, the same network of factors and branch managers applied to a new commodity that happened to be irreplaceable. Pope Sixtus IV, who would later find himself entangled in the very different affair of the Pazzi family, issued a formal prohibition on the import of Ottoman alum into Christian territories. The framing was religious, the effect was economic. The Medici and their associated agents held, as near as the 15th century allowed, a monopoly on the mineral that made European cloth worth wearing. A monopoly is a simple machine. Everyone who needs the thing must come to you. You set the price within the limits of what the market will bear before it searches for alternatives or collapses demand. The Tolfa deposits were substantial enough, and the need urgent enough, and the alternatives distant enough, that for a period the Medici alum operation was very nearly exactly that, a single choke point through which a vital industrial input passed on its way from Roman hills to Flemish looms and Florentine dye houses. The revenues from that choke point flowed partly to Rome, partly to the operations themselves, and partly through the bank's management fees, its credit extensions, its transport arrangements, and its factor networks. To the Medici balance sheet, it was, in the language of a much later age, a resource play. The Renaissance was not only a cultural flowering, it was an economy built on textiles, and textiles were built on chemistry, and for a crucial generation, the chemistry of European textile production ran in significant part through the hands of the family that was already managing the Pope's money and lending to the kings of the north, the grey rock at Tolfa. Not much to look at, everything to the people who needed it. Now hold that thread, the alum, the textile world, the northern markets, and let it guide us northward, because the bank was not only a Roman institution or a Florentine one. The Medici Bank at its height was a European network, a system of legally separate but cooperating offices spread across the continent's commercial geography, each one placed where money needed to move and where cloth and wool and bills of exchange converged. To understand the bank as a machine, you need to follow the machine to its furthest rooms. The headquarters, of course, was Florence, where the senior partners held the majority interest in each subsidiary and where the libri segreti of the whole network were ultimately reconciled. The Rome branch was the engine of consistent profit, the papal treasury connection that fed the whole system's base income and made the family's credit unimpeachable. But Rome was not where the growth edge of European commerce lived in the middle decades of the 15th century. The growth edge was north. Venice was one of the bank's branches, a city of commercial sophistication and maritime reach that needed no instruction in finance, and where the Medici competed with Venetian merchant banks on equal terms. Milan was another, a city increasingly important under the Sforza dukes, where political alliance and commercial opportunity overlapped in the way they always did in Italian banking. Naples had a branch, and Pisa, and the bank maintained a presence in Avignon, a city that still carried ecclesiastical weight from the decades when the papacy had resided there, and the flow of clerical money had pooled in its banking houses. Geneva held a branch for a time. The great fairs of Geneva were among the periodic clearinghouse events of European commerce, where merchants from a dozen countries settled accounts and transferred credit without the need to move gold across mountains, before the operation shifted to Lyon, when Lyon's fairs grew in importance. This kind of movement, a branch following the commercial gravity of a trading fair from one city to another, tells you something important about how the bank thought of its offices. They were not monuments, they were positions in a living geography of European trade, and positions that needed to be updated as the geography shifted. But it was the two northernmost branches that deserve the longest attention, because they are where the bank's ambitions extended furthest and where, in the end, its losses cut deepest. Bruges. In the middle of the 15th century, Bruges was one of the great cities of the commercial world. It was the meeting point of the Mediterranean and the North Sea, the place where Florentine and Genoese and Venetian merchants conducted their business with the cloth producers of Flanders and the merchants of the Hanseatic League from the Baltic. The word the contemporary world would use is hub, though no one in the 15th century had that word in this sense. What they had was the canal system and the harbour and the great trading houses and the weight of long custom that made Bruges the place where northern and southern European commerce shook hands. The Medici branch in Bruges was not a minor outpost. It was a significant operation dealing in the goods and credits that connected the textile production of Flanders to the capital markets of Italy. Wool went north, finished cloth and sophisticated goods moved south. Bills of exchange crossed in both directions, netting against each other in the elaborate clearing of debts that constituted the invisible bloodstream of European trade. And the branch was managed for a critical period by a man named Tommaso Portinari. Portinari was a Florentine, as branch managers generally were. The Medici preferred to place their own people in charge, men who had grown up in the same culture of ledgers and letters and could be trusted, at least in theory, to uphold the bank's standards for careful lending. He had been in Bruges for years, had grown into the role, and had, in the process, developed the characteristic affliction of men who manage other people's money from a position of great physical distance from their principals. He had begun to confuse the prestige of the clients he dealt with for the soundness of the loans he extended to them. Portinari was not a foolish man. He understood banking, but Bruges placed him in proximity to the great noble houses of the Burgundian court, and the Burgundian court in this period was one of the most glittering and self-consciously magnificent establishments in Europe. The Dukes of Burgundy, Philip the Good, and then his son Charles, who would be called the Bold, were men who spent lavishly, displayed magnificently, and borrowed accordingly. And they borrowed in very substantial sums from the Medici Bank's Bruges branch, with Tommaso Portinari as the man who signed the credits and who justified them to Florence in his correspondence. Before we come to what that meant for the bank, pause on one thing that came out of Portinari's time in Bruges, because it is one of those moments where the commerce and the culture of this world became the same thing so completely that it is impossible to separate them. Around 1475, Tommaso Portinari commissioned a large altarpiece from the Flemish painter Hugo van der Goes. The commission was substantial, an ambitious triptych on a scale that announced serious wealth and serious piety together, in the way that the great devotional commissions of the period always did. Hugo van der Goes was one of the significant painters working in the Flemish tradition at that time, part of the astonishing run of visual imagination that had flowered in the Low Countries across the 15th century. The world of Jan van Eyck's almost hallucinatory detail, of Roger van der Weden's still grief, of paintings that seemed to capture the texture of cloth and the luminosity of skin with a precision that made Italian painters sit up and study. The altarpiece that van der Goes made for Portinari was large, ambitious, and deeply serious. It depicted the adoration of the shepherds in a way that placed its humble figures, actual Flemish shepherds, coarse-faced and wondering, not the idealized figures of Italian devotional convention, before the Holy Child with a realism that was startling. The donors, including Tommaso Portinari himself, his wife Maria Baroncelli, and their children, kneel on the wings, portrayed in that Flemish tradition of meticulous personal likeness that made each face unmistakably that specific person. And then, when the altarpiece was finished, Portinari had it shipped to Florence. Across the Alps, over the mountain routes, through the same passes that carried wool and silk and bills of exchange, a great panel painting crated and carried south from the Flemish north to the Tuscan city. It arrived at the Basilica of Sant'Egidio in Florence in 1483 and was hung there, and the Florentine painters came to look at it. Ghirlandaio came. The workshops of Florence encountered in this painting, commissioned by a bank manager in Bruges, a concentrated lesson in northern technique, in a way of handling light and surface that was different from what the Italians were doing, and the encounter left marks. A bank branch, a branch manager's ambition and piety, a Flemish painter's uncommon talent, a shipping arrangement across a continent. And the result was an artwork that changed how painters painted. The Portinari altarpiece is one of the cleaner examples of what the bank actually did beneath all the accounts and credits. It moved value, attention, ideas, and beautiful things across the distances of Europe, and the motion itself was generative. But Portinari was also in the end a cautionary tale about what happens when a branch manager loses discipline. The loans to Charles the Bold were large. They grew larger than the guidelines the central office had set for sovereign lending. Larger than the prudence of a separate partnership structure was designed to accommodate, because the point of that structure was that each branch's exposure was meant to be contained, its capital ring-fenced from the losses of other branches. But the ring fence only holds if the branch manager respects the limits, and Portinari was a man in the orbit of a brilliant, dangerous, extravagant duke, and he did not always respect the limits. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, was one of the most vivid and destructive personalities of the later 15th century. He was ambitious in the way that men become when they are very rich and have just enough power to believe they could have more. He wanted to consolidate his disparate territories, the Low Countries, Burgundy itself, the patchwork of counties and duchies that the luck of inheritance had assembled, into something more coherent, something that could stand beside France and the Holy Roman Empire as an equal. He campaigned, he fought, he borrowed. He was a difficult client in the way that all clients with crowns were difficult. Their prestige made the loan feel safe, and their sovereign immunity made recovery, if they defaulted, essentially impossible. And then, in January of 1477, at a place called Nancy, in a battle against the Swiss and the Lorraine forces who had been resisting his campaigns, Charles the Bold was killed. He was found, days later, face down in a frozen pond near the battlefield. The body was identified partly by a scar and partly by the unusually long fingernails of a man who had not been able to bathe properly in the final days of a difficult campaign. He was 43 years old, and he had been, in the last years of his reign, a client of the Medici Bruges branch for very substantial sums. No court in the world could compel a dead duke's estate to repay a Florentine bank on any schedule the bank found convenient. The legal arrangements that governed ducal succession and territorial inheritance in Burgundy were not designed with creditors in mind. The loans that Portinari had extended, loans that had already been stretched beyond what the bank's own policies in calmer days would have sanctioned, were now the obligation of a disputed estate in the hands of Charles's daughter, Mary of Burgundy, who had her own pressing military and political emergencies to manage and no particular reason to prioritize the balance sheet of a Florentine branch bank. The Bruges branch was effectively gutted. The losses were not recoverable in any short term, and perhaps not in any term at all. Portinari, the man who had commissioned the most significant Flemish painting of the decade, who had supervised the shipping of Van der Goes's masterpiece across the mountains to Florence, was also the man whose decisions in the orbit of Burgundian magnificence had detonated a branch that the Medici holding structure was supposed to protect. The structure had been designed precisely to prevent this kind of catastrophe from spreading. Each compagnia, a separate legal entity, walled off from the others. But the wall only holds if the investment inside it is sound. The Bruges branch's losses were contained in the sense that they did not legally drag down Florence, but the capital was gone, and with it a significant part of the network's capacity. And Bruges was not the only wound. London had its own version of the same story, with its own cast of characters and its own particular texture of sovereign risk made real. The English branch of the Medici Bank had done what branch banks in trading cities generally did. It facilitated the wool trade, provided credit and letters of exchange to the English merchants, whose wool was the raw material that fed the Flemish looms, and moved money through the reliable mechanisms of bills of exchange across the Channel and down through France and over the Alps to Florence and Rome. But the branch had also, in the manner of the northern offices, found itself in the proximity of power and had lent to it. The power in England in the 1460s and 1470s was a complicated and often violent thing, because England was in the middle of a civil war and the protracted, dynastic, occasionally catastrophic conflict that later ages would call the Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of York and Lancaster for control of the English crown. Men with credible claims to kingship rose and fell and rose again. Alliances shifted, armies marched and disbanded. The man who was king at the beginning of a given year was not guaranteed to be king at its end. One of the men who was king with greater consistency than most was Edward IV of the House of York. Edward was a vigorous man, politically astute for much of his reign, and an effective king by the standards of his turbulent time. He was also a client of the Medici London branch, to whom the bank had extended very substantial credits. Edward IV did not die in battle on a frozen pond. He died in his bed in 1483 at the age of 40, of causes that are still discussed, possibly a chill, possibly something more serious, possibly the accumulated effect of a life lived at the edges of physical and political endurance. But the effect on the Medici balance sheet was similar to what Charles the Bold's death had meant in Bruges, because substantial portions of what Edward owed the London branch were never repaid. A king, like a duke, could simply not pay. There was no mechanism of enforcement available to a Florentine bank against the English crown that would be quick, reliable, or even ultimately effective. The letters of complaint that pass between the London branch and the Florence office have that particular tone of men who understand they are owed money they are unlikely to see, writing to men who understand the same thing, and everyone being very careful in their language because the situation is delicate and the alternatives are worse. The London branch's losses from the English sovereign loans were not the only strain on its position. but they were significant. The combination of royal debts, the costs of operating in a market far from the centre, and the general turbulence of English politics in this period put the London office under sustained pressure that it did not recover from cleanly. Here then is the pattern that emerges from the northern branches, and it is a pattern worth holding clearly in mind because it explains something about the nature of the machine and why it eventually broke down. The Medici Bank had been designed by Giovanni di Bicci, extended and refined by Cosimo, with a clear-eyed understanding of where lending to sovereigns led. The early guidance of the bank was cautious about princely loans, not because the Medici lacked the prestige or the nerve to make them, but because the men who had built the machine understood what sovereign default meant. A merchant who could not repay could be sued, his goods seized, his guarantors called upon. A king could not. The legal infrastructure that protected commercial debt had no ceiling high enough to reach a crown. The holding company structure, the separate company, each a walled-off legal entity, was in part a defense against exactly this kind of concentrated loss. If one branch made a catastrophic loan to a monarch who then defaulted or died, the loss would be contained within that branch's capital. The other branches would survive. The Florence operation would survive. The papal treasury relationship would survive. The machine would lose a part but keep running. But the structure only worked if the parts could actually be contained. And in the case of the Bruges branch under Portinari and the London branch with its English sovereign exposure, the losses were large enough and the management loose enough that the containment was far from clean. The capital was gone, the credibility was strained, and the men in Florence who should have been watching, who should have been reading the correspondence, auditing the accounts, calling branch managers back when their books showed concentration risks that the policy did not permit, were, as we will come to understand, increasingly occupied with other things. The machine had rules. The rules existed because the men who built the machine understood the difference between the prestige of a client and the soundness of a credit. They understood that a crown is a fine thing to be associated with and a terrible collateral. They understood that the separate partnership structure was only as strong as the discipline of the partners who ran the separate branches, and that discipline required oversight from the center, and oversight required attention, and attention required someone in Florence who was actually paying attention to the bank. In the 1470s, the person in Florence who should have been paying that attention was Lorenzo, and Lorenzo was paying attention to other things, to politics, to poetry, to the great flowing project of Florentine cultural life that his patronage was sustaining and enlarging. The bank ran. It ran less well than it had run under his grandfather. The branch managers did what branch managers do when central oversight relaxes. Some were prudent, many were ambitious, and a few were reckless. The machine's genius had always been that its structure limited the damage any single reckless manager could do. But when multiple branches were under strain simultaneously, and when the center was not watching with the alertness that the structure required, the limits of the structure became visible. The alum operation continued. The bills of exchange continued to cross the mountains. The papal treasury relationship continued, though it too was under periodic strain from the political turbulence of the late 1470s. The libri segreti continued to be kept, their columns recording what the working books did not show. And the network of branches, Florence, Rome, Venice, Naples, Milan, Pisa, Geneva, Lyon, Avignon, Bruges, London, continued to function, to correspond, to move credit and goods and information across the continent. But something had changed. The machine was not broken, not yet. It was running on the momentum of what Cosimo had built, and on the structural resilience that the separate partnership design had always provided. The Bruges losses were real, but contained. The London losses were real, but survivable. The alum revenues continued to flow. The Rome branch continued to turn its quiet, steady profit from the Apostolic Camera. The late afternoon light of the Renaissance was still warm. But anyone who had been watching the books carefully, anyone who had the habit of sitting with the libri segreti and reading not just the totals, but the trend lines, not just this year's balance, but the comparison of this year to 3 years ago and 5 years ago, would have seen something in the numbers that the beautiful surface of Florentine cultural life concealed entirely. The trend lines were not good. The branch capital figures that Raymond Aruva would later reconstruct from the surviving Mediceo Avanti il Principato documents tell the story with the flatness that numbers always use when they are delivering bad news. The bank's overall capital and the surpluses of the profitable branches were covering the losses of the damaged ones, but the surpluses were not unlimited, and the losses were not small, and the attention that would have been required to stop the bleeding at the northern branches had not been forthcoming with the speed that the situation demanded. Portinari remained in Bruges for years after the Charles the Bold disaster, managing a diminished operation in a city whose commercial importance was itself beginning to shift. The silting of the harbour at Bruges would accelerate in the coming decades, and the centre of Flemish trade would drift toward Antwerp, as though the losses had been a weather event rather than a management failure. The correspondence between Bruges and Florence has that quality. The situation is acknowledged, the losses are recorded, and then the letters go on to discuss other business, as though acknowledging the problem were the same thing as solving it. This is what organizational decline looks like from the inside, when it is happening slowly enough that no single moment announces itself as the turning point. The Medici Bank in the late 1470s and into the 1480s was not collapsing. It was losing ground gradually, in the way that a structure loses ground when the maintenance that holds it together is performed less thoroughly than the design requires. A roof does not fall in immediately when the tiles begin to slip. It fails slowly. Then, suddenly, when the accumulated damage meets a storm large enough to find the weakness, the storm was coming. But it had not arrived yet, and from the streets of Florence in the early years of Lorenzo's reign, what was visible was not the trend line in the Libri Segreti, but the city itself. The new buildings, the art commissions, the flow of poets and philosophers through the Medici gardens at Careggi, the sense of a civilization at its own high watermark, generous and confident and curious about everything. The Portinari altarpiece had arrived in Florence, and the painters were studying it. Botticelli was at work on images that would be among the most celebrated paintings in the history of Western art. The young Michelangelo was still a child, but he was growing up in a world where the question of what the human body could do when rendered in marble or bronze was being answered anew with almost every commission. The city was luminous with its own achievement, and in the Palazzo Medici, in the rooms where the business correspondence was filed and the account books were kept, and the junior partners drafted their letters to Bruges and London and Rome, the columns of numbers were adding to their sums. Some of those sums were smaller than they had been, some of the trend lines were moving in the wrong direction, but the ink was still fresh, and the florin was still the soundest coin in Europe, and the name that appeared at the top of the correspondence was still the most trusted name in European finance. For now, Lorenzo de' Medici had been born into a world already shaped by his grandfather's genius, and he had the particular advantage and disadvantage of inheriting something magnificent. Cosimo had built the structure, Piero the Guti had held it, Lorenzo received it when it was still, by most external measures, the most sophisticated private financial institution in Europe. A constellation of separately chartered partnerships, a network of branch offices from the Thames to the Tiber, a papal treasury relationship that had been generating profits for 3 generations, a monopoly on a mineral the whole textile economy of the continent could not do without. He received all of this at the age of 20 in 1469 when his father Piero died, and what Lorenzo did with it tells you something important about what greatness actually means and how rarely it distributes itself evenly across a single life. He was, by the testimony of nearly everyone who knew him, a genuinely extraordinary person. Not handsome. Contemporaries were candid about that, noting the flat nose, the sallow complexion, the slightly ungainly bearing. But in a room, he was unmistakable. He spoke several languages. He wrote poetry that serious scholars have judged to be genuinely accomplished, not merely the polite productions of a wealthy amateur. He could argue philosophy with the sharpest minds of his age and hold his own, which was not a small thing in a Florence where Pico della Mirandola was working out a synthesis of Platonic and Christian thought that would take centuries to fully absorb. He had an instinct for human beings that made him, in the language of statecraft, almost supernaturally skilled. He could read a room, read an adversary, read the temperature of a political situation with an accuracy that his enemies found bewildering. He kept Florence out of wars that would have broken it. He mediated between powers that wished each other harm. He was called the Magnificent, and in the domains of culture and statecraft, the epithet was earned. But the bank was something else. The bank required a particular species of attention, daily, granular, relentless, undramatic, that did not suit Lorenzo's temperament, and that he did not much enjoy providing. The libri segreti needed reading, the branch managers needed supervising, the letters from Bruges and London needed answering with precision and firmness, not with the flowing prose of a poet, but with the exact numerical reasoning of an accountant. Cosimo had possessed both kinds of mind, which is why he was among the rarest of human beings and why the structure he built was so durable. Lorenzo possessed one kind of mind, and over the course of the years that followed, the bank, which the Cosimo-era rules had made structurally robust, but which required human vigilance to remain so, began very slowly to drift. The branch managers, who had operated under the bracing awareness that their correspondence would be read carefully and their decisions questioned and their lending book scrutinized, did not, under Lorenzo, feel quite the same weight of supervision. Not immediately, not all at once. The structure held for a while because structures built well tend to hold even after the people inside them stop tending them with the original care. But the rules that Cosimo and Giovanni di Bicci before him had established about sovereign lending, the caution, the reluctance to extend too much credit to kings and dukes whose debts no court could enforce, those rules required constant reinforcement to survive because the temptation to lend to princes was always there, and the managers of distant branches felt it acutely. A loan to a duke gave you prestige, it gave you access, it gave you the feeling of proximity to power that branch managers of merchant banks living in foreign cities found deeply attractive, and without a firm hand from the Palazzo Medici reminding them that the feeling of proximity to power was not the same thing as a secured debt, the temptation was difficult to resist. Bruges was where the consequences arrived first, and they arrived wearing the name Tommaso Portinari. Portinari had been with the Medici Bank for decades by the time he became the effective head of the Bruges branch. He was capable, ambitious, and deeply susceptible to exactly the kind of courtly prestige that made the Burgundian court so dangerous to anyone who lent it money. Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, ruled one of the richest and most theatrical courts in Europe, and he had a talent for borrowing money in quantities that suggested he regarded other people's capital as a natural resource to be extracted at will. Portinari lent to Charles. Then he lent more, then more still, in amounts that would have made Cosimo de' Medici write a very short and very pointed letter back to Bruges, and which instead accumulated on the branch's books as a growing exposure to a single sovereign borrower with no collateral the bank could touch. On the 5th of January 1477, Charles the Bold died in the snow outside Nancy, defeated in battle, his body found days later, partly eaten by wolves, recognized eventually by his servants by the long fingernails and the old battle scars. It was an end so brutal and undignified that it seems almost too literary to be historical. But it was historical, and the consequence for the Medici branch at Bruges was immediate and severe. The enormous sums Portinari had lent to Charles died in that field alongside the Duke. There was no estate in Europe that could be compelled to repay what a dead sovereign owed a foreign bank. The money was simply gone, absorbed into the catastrophe of a battle, and the Bruges branch, which had been generating profits, which had sent the Portinari altarpiece back to Florence, which had been a functional piece of the machine, was effectively destroyed. The Portinari altarpiece, painted by Hugo van der Goes around 1475 and shipped from Bruges to Florence, had arrived in the city and caused painters to stop and look. The figures in it were painted with a naturalism that was startling even by Flemish standards, and Florentine artists crowded around it with the focused attention of people encountering a technique they had not seen before. The altarpiece was a genuine cultural event, and it had been paid for in some sense by the profits of a branch that no longer existed. The art outlasted the account that funded it. This is how culture so often survives. The thing made endures long after the circumstances that made its making possible have dissolved completely. London was failing by a different mechanism, but failing nonetheless. The English branch had made substantial loans to King Edward IV during the Wars of the Roses, that grinding dynastic conflict between the houses of York and Lancaster that had made England for decades a place where political certainty was a luxury no creditor could afford. Edward was a formidable king in many ways, but formidable kings and reliable debtors are not always the same person, and the sums extended to the English crown accumulated in the branch's books as obligations that the English court showed no great urgency in settling. Raymond de Ruva, working from the surviving Medici account books in the Florentine archives, the Mediceo Avanti il Principato, that great collection of preserved correspondence and ledgers that let a 20th century historian reconstruct the bank's real finances, documented the London losses with the clarity that only primary sources permit. The branch bled. The losses were real and substantial, and they did not stay in London. They rippled backward through the structure because the separate partnership design that was supposed to wall off branch disasters from the central family capital still required that someone, somewhere, absorb the damage, and that someone was ultimately the Medici Maggiori who held the controlling interest in every compagnia. What de Ruva's analysis makes clear, and what the popular understanding of the Medici tends to obscure, is that the bank's decline was not primarily bad luck. It was primarily bad management. The structural innovations that Giovanni di Bicci had built and that Cosimo had refined were genuinely brilliant, but they were not self-executing. They depended on central oversight, on the periodic tightening of lending rules, on the willingness of the senior Medici partner to write those short and pointed letters to branch managers who were chasing the wrong kind of prestige. Lorenzo did not write enough of those letters. He was busy governing Florence through the most complex political landscape in Italy, busy commissioning paintings and inviting philosophers to his table at Careggi, busy being the magnificent, which was itself an exhausting and not entirely voluntary role. The bank suffered in proportion to his distraction. This is not entirely a criticism of Lorenzo. The demands on him were real, and what he built in Florence's cultural life was genuinely extraordinary. But the bank required a different man, and that man was not available. And then, on the 26th of April, 1478, the morning that began in Santa Maria del Fiore turned into something that Florence would not forget for the rest of its history. It was High Mass. The cathedral was full. Lorenzo and his brother Giuliano were present, as they often were, on significant feast days, visible to the congregation, the living symbols of the family that had made Florence what it was. The Pazzi family, The Medici's great rivals in banking, the family that had most to gain from breaking the Medici grip on Florentine finance and Florentine politics, had been planning for months. The conspiracy involved not only the Pazzi themselves but also figures connected to Pope Sixtus IV, who had his own grievances against Lorenzo, and a group of men who had concluded that the way to change Florence's direction was to remove the people directing it. At the moment of the elevation of the host, when the priest raised the consecrated bread and every head in the cathedral bowed in worship, the conspirators moved. Giuliano de' Medici was stabbed. He was stabbed repeatedly, more than once, more than twice, enough times that historians accounting for the wounds have described the attack as frenzied. He died in the cathedral on the stone floor, while the congregation dissolved into screaming. Lorenzo was also attacked and was wounded, but he had people around him and he was able to get to the sacristy and barricade himself inside, and he survived. The conspiracy, which had been intended to end with both brothers dead and the Pazzi moving into the political vacuum, instead ended with one brother dead and the other enraged and in power, and now possessed of a specific, personal, burning motivation to be ruthless. The reprisals were severe. The Pazzi were destroyed as a family, properties confiscated, members imprisoned or executed, the very name suppressed in Florence. Those involved in the conspiracy or deemed connected to it were hunted. Botticelli, who was among the artists closest to the Medici, was commissioned to paint defamatory portraits of the executed conspirators on the wall of a public building in Florence. Those hanging portraits, called pitture infamanti, that turned the act of public execution into an image that would last as long as the plaster. The frescoes are long gone, but the commission tells you something about how thoroughly the Medici fused art and power, how the same hand that paid for Donatello's bronze, David, could also direct the painting of a dead enemy's face on a wall for the city to walk past. The war that followed the conspiracy with the papacy with Naples drained Florentine finances in the way that wars always drain the finances of city-states that are not equipped to fight extended campaigns. The papacy placed Florence under interdict. The King of Naples joined the coalition against it. Lorenzo eventually resolved the crisis through a piece of personal diplomacy, so bold it was almost reckless. He sailed to Naples himself, appeared before the king, and negotiated a peace through the sheer force of his presence and reputation. It worked, which says something about what kind of man he was, but the cost of the war, the cost of the interdict, the disruption to trade, the political energy consumed, all of this was strain that the bank's already stretched resources had to absorb. The libri segreti, those confidential ledgers where the real profits were recorded, the secret books that had been the financial brain of the whole operation since Giovanni di Bicci's day, would have shown, through these years, a picture that the public face of the Palazzo Medici carefully did not advertise. The Rome branch, the ancient engine of profit, the Apostolic Camera relationship, the management of papal funds that had underwritten the bank's prestige and revenue for most of its existence, was also under strain by this period, the easy relationship with a friendly papacy having been replaced by the complicated politics of a pope who had been, in some accounts, at least aware of the conspiracy that killed Giuliano in his own cathedral. Lorenzo managed all of this. He kept Florence together. He kept the family name at the center of Italian politics. He did not let the Medici become just another Florentine family. But the bank continued to decline, and the decline was structural and human and managerial, and the brilliant political intellect that could hold a city-state together could not simultaneously rebuild the discipline that 3 generations of careful bankers had established, and that 1 generation of inattentive ones had allowed to erode. He died in April of 1492. He was 43 years old, which was not young but was not old either, and the Florence he left behind was genuinely poorer for his absence, culturally, politically, temperamentally. The city had been shaped by his personality in ways that became visible only after he was gone, the way a room sometimes reveals its true proportions only after the furniture is removed. What he left his son Piero was not the bank his grandfather had built. It was a diminished thing, its best branches gutted, its sovereign loans largely unrecoverable, its managerial culture corroded by decades of insufficient oversight. The nome Piero di Lorenzo received in history, Piero the Unfortunate, suggests that the historical verdict came in early and came in unanimously. And then, in 1494, came the storm. Charles V of France had decided that Italy was an opportunity. The claim was dynastic, a descent line on paper that gave him, in theory, a right to the Kingdom of Naples. The reality was simpler. Italy was wealthy, divided, and could not resist a properly organized French army crossing the Alps. Charles VIII crossed with an army, and the question for every Italian state was what posture to take before something that large moving that fast. Piero de' Medici made his decision. He rode out to meet Charles, and without authorization, without the consent of the Florentine Signoria, without negotiation, without even the pretense of consulting the institutions of the Republic his family had governed for 60 years, he surrendered to the French king the Florentine fortresses that controlled the passes into Tuscany. He gave away the keys to the city in exchange for nothing the city would recognize as adequate. Florence heard what had happened and reacted with the swiftness of a city that had been holding its patience for years. On November 9, 1494, the Medici were expelled. Piero fled. The mob entered the Palazzo Medici, and what the family had not managed to remove or conceal was seized or destroyed. The bank, which had already been gutted by 2 decades of managed decline, by the Bruges disaster and the London losses and the fraying of the Apostolic Camera relationship and the sovereign defaults that no court had ever made good, ceased to function as an institution. Its assets were confiscated in the upheaval. What had been founded by Giovanni di Bicci in 1397, built by Cosimo into the most sophisticated financial organization in Europe, sustained across 3 more generations with varying degrees of competence and care, ended here in November of 1494, in the noise of a city turning on the family that had governed it. And in that same year, 1494, in Venice, a friar named Luca Pacioli published a book called the Summa de Arithmetica, Geometria, Proportioni et Proportionalita. It was the first printed treatise to set out in systematic, codified form the method of double-entry bookkeeping, partita doppia, the very technique that Florentine and Venetian merchants had been practicing for 150 years. The technique the Medici Bank had elevated into the operational principle of a continental financial empire. Pacioli did not invent the method, he described and codified it. He is called, even now, the father of accounting, and what he published in 1494 was a monument to a tradition of numerical precision that the Italian merchant cities had developed over generations. The year 1494 is therefore one of those rare moments in history where 2 things that seem entirely unrelated happen simultaneously and illuminate each other perfectly. A bank that had perfected the technique of the secret book and the balanced ledger collapsed in Florence. A printed book appeared in Venice explaining exactly how that technique worked. The practice ended in one place at the moment its theory was being published somewhere else. The Medici Bank died in the same year that the Medici Bank's accounting method received its formal epitaph. There is something quiet and almost unbearable about that coincidence. The secret books, the libri segreti, the columns of debits and credits that had funded a bronze David and a marble arcade, and the Greek manuscripts that Cosimo had sent men to collect from the ruins of Byzantium. Those same columns, those same techniques, set down in print for the first time in the year they stopped generating the profits that had made Florence luminous. As if the knowledge could only be committed fully to writing once the thing it described was already finished, In the Florence that the Medici left behind, a figure rose who could not have been more different from Lorenzo if he had been designed by someone who found the entire Medici project morally intolerable. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara who had been preaching in Florence since the mid-1480s and who had, over the course of those years, developed a following among Florentines who were genuinely troubled by the gap between the city's Christian professions and its actual behavior. He was ascetic, he was fierce. He believed that Florence had sinned in the precise and literal sense that a medieval theologian would recognize, had worshipped wealth and beauty and pagan learning and the brilliant surfaces of Neoplatonic philosophy at the expense of the plain duties of Christian virtue. After the Medici were expelled, Savonarola became, for several years, the effective moral voice of the Florentine Republic. He preached with a force that his listeners found difficult to resist, even when they tried. He organized the bonfire of the vanities, the burning of mirrors, cosmetics, wigs, secular books, playing cards, fine clothing, and artworks in a public space, a spectacular public ceremony of renunciation that inverted everything the Medici patronage project had stood for. The objects that the bank's profits had funded, the objects that the exchange of bills of cambio and the careful management of alum revenues had made possible. The paintings, the books, the beautiful and worldly things were reduced to smoke and ash in the public square as an act of religious penitence. Savonarola himself was burned in 1498 in the same square where the bonfire had been made, executed by papal condemnation and popular revulsion after his political credibility collapsed and his prophecies failed to be confirmed by events. But his brief, fierce dominance over Florence illustrates something about what the Medici achievement actually looked like from the outside, from the perspective of people who had lived in its shadow and were now free to say plainly what they thought. The brilliance and the luxury were real, the costs were real too, and people had noticed them. But the Medici were not finished. This is the thing that makes their story different from the simple rise and fall narrative that would be tidier and perhaps more satisfying. The bank was finished. The bank died in 1494, definitively seized and dissolved and dispersed. The libri segreti either lost or confiscated. The branch network that had stretched from the Thames to the Tiber, existing now only in the records that historians like de Ruva would eventually piece back together from the surviving fragments in the Florentine archives. The institution died. The family did not. Lorenzo's son, Giovanni, who had been made a cardinal at the age of 13 through the combination of Medici influence and papal gratitude that had characterized the family's relationship with the Church for 100 years, became Pope Leo X in 1513. He was the first Florentine pope, a fact that would have pleased his father enormously and that demonstrated with perfect clarity how thoroughly the Medici had penetrated the institutions of European power during the century of the bank's operation. His cousin, Giulio de' Medici, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. Two Medici popes within a decade of each other, at a moment when the family's banking institution had been dead for 30 years. The financial machine that Giovanni di Bicci had constructed, the profit engine that Cosimo had refined, the structure that had been slowly hollowed out under Lorenzo and finally seized in 1494. All of it had served its ultimate purpose, to make the Medici name so embedded in the power structures of Europe that even the death of the bank could not dislodge the family from those structures. The dynasty continued into forms its founders could not have imagined. Cosimo I de' Medici, who was not a direct descendant in the main line but a Medici nonetheless, became Duke of Florence in 1537 and Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569, turning what had been a merchant republic into a proper hereditary state with the Medici at its head. The family that had governed Florence through influence and gold and the soft power of patronage became the family that governed it through titles, succession, and the formal apparatus of a court. Giovanni di Bicci, who had trained in a Rome counting house and moved his operation to Florence in 1397 and built his fortune on the careful maintenance of double-entry books and the cultivation of the papal treasury relationship, would likely not have recognized the Grand Duchy as the product of what he began, but it was. And Catherine de' Medici became Queen of France, wife of Henri II, mother of 3 French kings, one of the most influential political figures of the 16th century French court, a woman whose correspondence and whose long, shadowy influence on French politics would occupy historians for centuries. Marie de' Medici became Queen of France after her, wife of Henri IV, mother of Louis X, patron of Rubens. 2 Medici queens of France. The family that had made its money-moving gold across Europe through bills of exchange and branch offices and the careful management of the papal treasury had, within 3 or 4 generations of the bank's collapse, placed its daughters on the throne of the largest kingdom in Europe. The bank funded the transformation. The transformation outlasted the bank by centuries. What does this mean when you hold it up to the light and look at it steadily? The Medici Bank was, in its finest decades, a technology, not a treasure in the simple sense, not a pile of gold sitting in a vault being guarded, but a set of practices, a way of organizing information and risk and capital and human incentive that was genuinely ahead of its time. The libro segreto was a technology. The separate partnership structure, each compagnia a legally distinct entity so that the failure of one could not automatically drag down the others, was a technology, a method of containing risk that anticipated the logic of the modern holding company by 400 years. The lettera di cambio, the bill of exchange that could move value from Florence to Bruges without moving a single coin on a road where bandits waited, was a technology. The double-entry ledger, the partita doppia that required every debit to have a credit, that made the book self-correcting and therefore self-revealing when something went wrong. That was a technology. These technologies did not appear from nowhere. They were the accumulated product of generations of Italian merchant practice, refined and systematized and elevated to their highest expression by a family that also happened to be, in 2 of its generations, among the most brilliant practical administrators in European history. Luca Pacioli's Summa de Arithmetica, published in 1494, captured in print what the Florentine merchants had learned through 150 years of practice. The Medici were not the inventors of double entry, they were its masters. There is a difference, and it matters because the mastery was what made everything else possible. The art was not incidental to the bank. The art was the exhaust of the engine, the visible evidence hanging on walls and standing in courtyards and built into the stone of church facades, of profits that the engine had generated and that its masters chose to spend in a particular way. Cosimo did not commission the rebuilding of San Marco because he was indifferent to where the money went. He commissioned it because he understood that money spent on visible, permanent, beautiful things performed a function that money spent on invisible things could not. It demonstrated legitimacy. It demonstrated taste. It demonstrated that the family which held the keys to the papal treasury also cared about the things that a civilization is supposed to care about: knowledge, beauty, the long conversation of human beings across generations about what it means to be alive. Donatello's bronze. David, the first freestanding nude since antiquity, stood in the courtyard of the Palazzo Medici. It was private. Most people in Florence would never see it. But the people who did see it, the ambassadors, the scholars, the painters, the rivals, the guests, understood exactly what it meant. It meant that the family which owned this courtyard was operating at a level of cultural confidence that most patrons in Europe could not access. Money can buy gold plate and tapestries and fine horses. A specific kind of money, combined with a specific kind of judgment, can buy the future of an art form. And then the machine runs too long without maintenance, and the branch manager in Bruges lends too much to a duke who will die in the snow, and the branch manager in London discovers that a king's debt is not a king's obligation, and the young man who inherits the machine is more interested in philosophy than in the letters that need to be written to the managers, and the tiles slip one by one, slowly enough that no single slip seems fatal, and then the storm arrives, as storms always arrive, and the accumulated slippage meets the force of the storm, and what was built over a century comes down in a single season. 1494, the Medici expelled, the bank seized, Savonarola in the piazza, the bonfire of the vanities consuming the objects that the centuries of profit had paid for, and Luca Pacioli in Venice, setting the accounting method into print for the first time, as if to say, this is how it was done for the record, for the ones who come after and want to understand how a family of Florentine merchants, operating out of offices in Rome and Bruges and London and Naples, managed for nearly 100 years to serve as the financial nervous system of a civilization. The libri segreti are in the Florentine archives now. The Mediceo avanti il Principato, the great collection of correspondence and account books preserved before the Medici became princes, sits in the Archivio di Stato in Florence, available to historians, a record of transactions and letters and profit calculations that Raymond Aruva spent decades working through in order to reconstruct what the bank had actually been. The secret books are no longer secret. They have been read by scholars and analyzed and cited in footnotes and described in academic prose. The numbers are available, the figures are known, and what the numbers say when you read them through Deruva's reconstruction is that the bank worked, and then it was not tended properly, and then it stopped working. The mechanism was sound. The human beings inside it were variable. The structure was designed to survive human variability up to a point. Past that point, it required something the later Medici could not provide: the daily, unglamorous, relentless attention of someone who cared more about the columns of the libro segreto than about the columns of the building going up in the piazza, more about the letters to the branch manager in Bruges than about the verse being composed in the garden at Careggi. That person existed once. His name was Giovanni di Bicci de Medici, and he trained in a counting house in Rome and moved his operation to Florence in 1397, and he built something that lasted, in its essential form, for nearly 100 years. And then there was Cosimo, who was both things at once, the careful banker and the brilliant patron, and who proved, for 2 or 3 extraordinary decades, that you did not have to choose. And then the choosing became unavoidable, and the bank was what lost. The dynasties survived, the bank did not, and the thing that survived longest of all, longer than the bank, longer than the republic it governed, longer than the Grand Duchy that replaced the republic, longer than the queens of France who carried the name to the northern courts, was the bronze and marble and painted wood and illuminated parchment that the bank's profits paid for. The Portinari altarpiece is in Florence, in the Uffizi, and people stand in front of it and look at the figures that stopped Florentine painters in their tracks when the crate from Bruges was opened in 1483. Donatello's bronze David is in the Bargello, and people stand in front of it and understand why the courtyard at the Palazzo Medici was a place where the question of what the human body could mean when rendered in bronze was being asked and answered at the same time. Botticelli's Primavera and Birth of Venus are in the Uffizi, and the light in those rooms on a winter afternoon is very calm, and the people moving through them are very quiet, and the paintings themselves are so familiar by now that it takes a particular effort to see them as the strange and original things they were when they were made, in a city that was generating that kind of strangeness from an accounting method and a mineral found in the hills near Rome, and a holding company structure that walled off the losses in Bruges from the profits in Florence. The money was a technology. The technology made a world The world made objects. The objects outlasted everything. And somewhere in the Archivio di Stato, in the collection that bears the name of the family before they became princes, the columns of the libro segreto are still balanced. Debit and credit. The books have closed and they will not be reopened for business, but they add up. They were always designed to add up. That was the whole point from the beginning, when a man trained in a Rome counting house brought his methods to Florence and began, in the careful and precise language of numbers, to write down what he owed and what was owed to him, and set beside each entry its mirror, and found that when he was done, the columns were equal, and the account was true. That is enough explaining for one night. Rest now